The valley lay in brittle silence that morning, as if the earth itself had been listening for too long and had grown weary of sound. Wind combed the grass in tired strokes, carrying dust like pale smoke over the ridges. A lone figure rode through that emptiness, his shadow long on the ground, his horse slow but steady, the sound of its hooves muffled as though it feared disturbing the quiet. That rider was Elijah Boone, and if ever a man was stitched together with silence, it was him. Folks in town said he carried more ghosts than friends, and perhaps they were right, for the lines in his face looked carved by grief rather than age. He came into town that day with little more than a saddlebag and a gaze that never quite met another's. His eyes were like old river stones, polished by years of loss. He walked among the townsfolk the way a man might walk through a dream he no longer believed in, present, but untethered. They watched him with the sharpness of those who feed on gossip to fill their own hunger. They called him unlucky when they whispered, though some said cursed. The woman he'd loved had been taken by fever, the land he'd tilled turned against him in drought, and cattle thieves had stripped what little remained. Still, he walked upright, not with pride exactly, but with a stubborn refusal to bend. It was at the general store where the matter of the cabin arose. A slip of paper on the wall, scrawled in hurried ink, "Cabin for sale, 12 cents. Folks laughed when they saw it. A child's prank, perhaps. 12 cents would hardly buy a nail, much less 4 walls and a roof. Yet when Elijah looked upon that note, something in him shifted. He asked no questions, only placed a dime and 2 pennies on the counter. The shopkeeper smirked, half amused, half pitying. "Boone," he said, "you just bought yourself a coffin in the weeds." Word spread quick. By evening, the town had its joke ready. Men in the saloon clinked glasses over the tale of Boone's cabin. Women whispered while pumping water, shaking their heads at such a fool's bargain. "The man's lost his wits," they said. But Elijah heard none of it, or if he did, he let it slide off him like rain on stone. For in his chest, beneath the rubble of his ruin, there stirred the faintest pulse of curiosity, or perhaps defiance. He rode out to claim what he had purchased. The trail was narrow, winding between sagebrush and scattered rocks. By the time he reached the cabin, the sun had sunk low, painting the sky in bruised colors. Before him stood a house the world had already given up on. Logs sagged inward, the roof hunched as though under the weight of years. The door leaned sideways, one hinge broken, swaying in the breeze with a creak that sounded like mourning. Windows, coated with grime, reflected no light. Elijah dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the earth that seemed more ash than soil. He laid his hand upon the cabin's frame, feeling the splinters prick his palm, the way one feels the bones of something once alive. There was no value here, not by a banker's measure, not by the jeers of town men. And yet, standing before it, he saw himself. Weathered, half-broken, abandoned by fortune, but still upright. He pushed the door and stepped inside. Darkness greeted him, thick and unmoving, broken only by narrow shafts of fading light seeping through cracks in the wood. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and dust left undisturbed. Each step stirred echoes that didn't belong to him, scurries of mice, the faint rattle of old iron. He saw rusted pots on a table crooked with age, a chair with one leg gone, a hearth that hadn't known fire for years. Yet there was something else. A stillness beneath the stillness, like breath held in fear. Elijah froze, his senses sharpening. He knew the sound of emptiness, and this was not it. From the far end of the room, beyond a door barely hanging to its frame, there came a faint sound, so soft he might have dismissed it as wind, had it not carried the rawness of pain. A whimper. Human, but broken, as though the voice behind it had been stripped of strength. He crossed the room, his boots slow on the warped boards. With each step, his pulse grew louder, though his face remained as stone. He pushed the door with the gentlest of force, and it gave way to a narrow space choked with shadows. At first he saw only the outline of rags piled in a corner. But then the rags moved. 2 eyes glinted from the dark, wide, hollow, wild. It was a woman. She crouched like a creature driven to ground, her limbs thin as sticks, her dress torn to threads. Dirt streaked her skin, her hair matted as though cut by time itself. Yet it was her eyes that seized him, not their color, for in the gloom, color had no place, but their desperation. They were the eyes of one who had stared too long at hunger, too long at cruelty, and had begun to believe the world would never again offer mercy. Her lips moved, cracked and trembling. At first no sound came. Then, in a whisper that carried more fear than strength, she said, "Please, don't tell them I'm here." Elijah's hand, still on the doorframe, tightened as if the wood could ground him. For a moment he thought of the town, of the laughter that still rang in the saloon, of the whispers that mocked his name. He thought of the cabin, bought for 12 cents, and how they had called it a coffin. Perhaps they were not wrong. Inside its bones, death had surely lingered. But here, before him, was not death. It was something else, fragile as smoke yet stubborn as fire. The woman pressed herself against the wall, as if to vanish into it, her eyes darting to the door, to his hands, to the space between them. Every inch of her spoke of mistrust. Elijah said nothing. Words had failed him often in his life, and he knew better than to try them. Elijah said nothing. Words had failed him often in his life, and he knew better than to try them now. Instead, he stepped back, giving her room, though the silence between them felt taut as a rope stretched to breaking. Her whisper came again, thinner now, as if she had given all her breath to that first plea. Don't let them find me." Elijah stood in the threshold, his shadow spilling across the floor toward her like a question. He had come to this cabin to claim something worthless, a hollow box the world had laughed at. Yet in the space of a heartbeat, that box had opened into a mystery deeper than he could reckon. The evening wind slipped through the cracks, carrying with it the sound of distant coyotes, their cries thin and hungry. The cabin creaked as though remembering things it had held before. Elijah's gaze never left the woman. He did not know her name, nor her story, nor why she hid in this ruin. But he knew the shape of her plea. It was the shape of every man or woman who had ever been cast aside and longed for a place to breathe. The darkness thickened, swallowing what little light remained. The woman's eyes still caught the faint glow, fixed on him with terror and hope intertwined. Elijah Boone, who had bought a coffin in the weeds, now stood on the edge of something he could not name. And in that breathless pause, with the night pressing close around them, the cabin seemed to lean forward, as if waiting to see what choice he would make. The fire crackled low, painting the cabin walls in wavering amber light. Elijah sat across from the stranger, her body curled tight in the blanket he had wrapped around her. She held a crust of bread in her hands as though it might vanish if she let go, eating with small, desperate bites, eyes darting between him and the door. Silence hung heavy, filled only by the sound of her chewing and the faint hiss of sap in the flames. He had not asked her name, nor had she offered it. He understood some truths broke easier when left unspoken, and tonight, silence seemed a safer language. Yet every glance she cast, full of suspicion and weariness, told him more than words could. She was not hiding from hunger alone. When the bread was gone, she leaned back against the log wall, the blanket slipping from her thin shoulders. For a moment her eyes closed, as if the simple act of eating had spent the last of her strength. Then, barely audible over the fire, she spoke. "They said I stole," she whispered, as though the walls themselves might betray her. Elijah didn't move. "I worked the wash house in town," she continued, her voice catching. "Scrubbed until my hands bled. A coin went missing from the foreman's desk, and she swallowed hard, shaking her head. "They decided it was me. No trial, no chance to speak. Just, spat on, beaten, and cast out." Her hands clutched the blanket tighter. "If I go back, they'll kill me. Or worse." Elijah's jaw tightened. He knew the town's cruelty well enough. It was always easier for them to wound the weak than face their own emptiness. Yet hearing it from her lips, raw, unvarnished, set a stone in his chest. "What's your name?" he asked at last. Her eyes flickered to him, wary, as if a name could be a weapon. After a pause she said, "Clara. Clara May." The name lingered in the air, fragile and human. Elijah gave a slow nod. He didn't offer his own, she already knew. Everyone knew Elijah Boone, the man cursed by loss. The man the town laughed at. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a ghost in his own story. Clara's presence had pulled him into a moment he could not step away from. Days bled into one another. Elijah rose early, as habit demanded, and worked the land around the cabin, though there was little to claim. Clara helped in quiet ways. At first, she simply watched, too thin and weak to do more. But soon she was fetching water from the stream, mending torn cloth with steady hands, gathering kindling. Her silence softened, not into chatter, but into the rhythm of shared labor. There was no declaration between them, no sudden intimacy. Only small mercies exchanged. She left a piece of bread by his plate before he sat. He laid an extra log by her fire when the nights grew colder. Trust did not bloom like fire, it smoldered slow, a heat barely noticed until one realized the cold had left. Still, the outside world was not blind. Whispers carried faster than horses, and by the end of the week the town was already stirring. Men in the saloon clinked glasses, mocking Boone's 12-cent bride. Women whispered over wash tubs, their voices sharp with scorn. Children repeated what they heard at home, cruel words stripped of understanding. One evening, as Elijah traded for flour, he felt the weight of every eye. A man leaned on the counter beside him, reeking of whiskey. "Heard you been hiding a thief out in that coffin you call a home," he sneered. "Careful, Boone. Won't be long before she robs you blind too." Elijah said nothing, just paid for his goods and left. But his silence did not quiet the rumors. It fed them. By the time he returned to the cabin, the anger in his chest burned hotter than the desert sun. Clara, sensing it, said nothing. Yet he saw in her eyes the guilt of one who feared she had ruined the only soul who'd shown her kindness. That night, she spoke again, voice brittle. "If you send me away, I'll understand." Elijah turned to her, his face carved in shadow by the fire. "This cabin was mine for 12 cents, he said, slow and deliberate. "But what's inside it now, your life, is worth more than they'll ever see." Clara's breath caught, though she made no reply. She simply pulled the blanket tighter, and for the first time since he'd found her, the fear in her eyes eased, if only a fraction. The days grew colder. Together they patched the roof with bark and scrap, mended the gaps in the walls with mud. When Clara laughed once, soft, surprised at herself, it startled Elijah more than any gunshot. It was a sound he had thought the world had forgotten. But peace was a fragile thing. One night, lanterns bobbed along the trail like a string of malevolent stars. Horses snorted, hooves thudded. Clara froze, her hands gripping the table until her knuckles whitened. Elijah stepped to the window and saw them, half a dozen townsmen, their faces hard with drink and righteousness. They stopped at the cabin door, knocking not with courtesy but with fists that rattled the hinges. "Boone," a voice barked. "We know she's in there. Bring her out. Thieves don't deserve shelter." The firelight flickered over Elijah's face as he opened the door. He stood tall in the frame, hands empty but presence unshaken. "She stays," he said. Murmurs rippled through the men, half disbelief, half fury. "You'll ruin yourself, Boone. This isn't your fight. Give her up and walk free." Elijah's gaze swept over them, steady as the weight of stone. "I lost my wife to fever. I lost my land to drought. I lost my cattle to thieves you never lifted a hand against. What else is there left for you to take from me? But this woman, this life, was given into my keeping. You'll not lay a hand on her while I draw breath." The silence that followed was sharp, stretched tight. The men shifted, their bravado flickering beneath his calm refusal. Lanterns hissed, horses pawed the dirt. For all their numbers, none stepped forward. Boone's words cut deeper than any blade, not in volume but in the weight of truth carried quiet. Finally, one spat into the dirt, muttering curses. Another turned his horse. One by one they drifted back into the night, their lanterns dimming with distance, until the valley was dark again. Elijah closed the door and leaned against it, listening to the pounding of his own heart. When he turned, Clara stood there, tears streaking her face. She whispered, "Why did you keep me?" His answer was soft, almost lost in the crackle of the dying fire. "Because someone once kept me, when I didn't deserve it." For a long time she said nothing, only wept quietly, the sound mingling with the wind against the cabin walls. Elijah stepped closer, not with grand gesture, but with the simple act of laying another log on the fire, ensuring its flame would not die before morning. When dawn broke, the cabin no longer seemed like a coffin. Smoke curled from its chimney, a fragile banner against the pale sky. Clara stood in the doorway, blanket around her shoulders, watching the horizon as though for the first time she might belong to it. Elijah stood beside her, silent as ever, but in that silence there was no emptiness. There was presence. The land stretched vast before them, still harsh, still unforgiving. Yet within those worn walls, something small but unyielding had taken root. Not love declared, not redemption complete, but the fragile beginning of both. And as the sun rose higher, the cabin seemed less a ruin and more a seed, something cheap in the world's eyes, yet holding within it the power to shelter a soul, to spark a fire, to teach two broken people the meaning of keeping.